Welcome back. We're going to pick up where we left off, changing workplace with the government piece. So, government regulation, particularly with regards to labor, has undergone a series of developments, let's put it that way. Now, historically, of course, laissez-faire ruled. It's keep the government out of the workplace, keep the government out of the economy.